Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We hope that you, your families, and friends are healthy and safe. Welcome to the AI for Good webinar, and we are so happy you came to join us. Today, we are going to discuss about how to develop accountable AI solutions. My name is Jinu from the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, which is the UN specialized agency for information and communication technologies. I'm joining today from Geneva, and I have the privilege of introducing today's webinar. ITU is the organizer of AI for Good Global Summit, alongside with XPRIZE in partnership with the 36 UN agencies, ACM, and co-convener Switzerland. The goal of the AI for Good Summit is to identify practical applications of AI that can help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this year, the AI for Good Summit 2020 is taking place throughout the year, always online. We are publishing weekly webinars, solution tracks, and keynotes that will allow us to reach even more people throughout the year. Today, we have a very distinguished panel featuring Amy van Weinsberg, Jan Kleijsen, and the discussion will be co-facilitated by Fitz and Arthur van der Vis. The panelists will present their remarks, but we are in particular counting on participants to help create an engaging discussion. So for this, we'll be using the Q&A functionality, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can also upload questions that were posed by others, which you'd like the facilitator to ask the panel. Additionally, there's the chat functionality, which you can use to have discussions with all other participants. And please make sure the message recipient is set to everyone and not just to panelists. So before we turn towards our panel, I'd like to ask everyone to use the chat functionality and let us know where you're connecting from. So which country or city. So please just type it into the chat and make sure you send it to everyone. We'll be able to have an idea of who is in the room from different places. So let me start by typing Geneva, Switzerland, myself, and I can see Milano, Berlin, UK, Armenia, New Jersey, India, Albania, Netherlands, Ottawa, Canada, Korea, Hague, Amsterdam, Estonia, Kenya. Wow, this is great. So I think we have very diverse participation connecting from all over the world. So that is very excellent. Now, I'm very much looking forward to engaging discussion with this diversity of perspectives. And with that, I think now is the time for me to hand it over to our facilitator, Fitz. Hello, Fitz. Are you ready?
Janu, thank you very much for that introduction, and also a warm welcome from my side. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Looking at the list, we have over 4 or 5 countries, continents present in our call today. So very happy with that. First of all, I'd like to welcome our speakers and my co-moderator. And I would like to thank the ITU for this opportunity to speak on accountability. Quick introduction, Fritz Bussemaker. I'm the co-founder and chair of the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age, and also the deputy chair of the Outreach Committee for the AI for Good Global Summit. So the topic today is how to develop accountable AI solutions. And we have 2 panel members we will make some opening remarks. First of all, Amy van Weinsberg. She's an assistant professor in ethics and robotics at the Technical University in Delft, and she will present on the role of data ethics. And secondly, we have Jan Kleijsen, Director of Information Society Action Against Crime, part of Council of Europe, which will take us on the Council of Europe's approach to establish a legal framework for AI. And Arthur van der Vis will also be joining us as a co-founder of the Institute and will be a co-moderator. So the agenda will be that we first have 2 presentations of about 10-15 minutes each. And afterwards, we'll have a discussion moderated by Arthur van der Vis with the 2 speakers, and hopefully also with a number of questions you have brought us in the chat. So to give you a little bit of context, the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age. First of all, this was set up in 2017, instigated by the late Dr. Inderjeet Bethenny. He was the director of Knowledge Societies at UNESCO, and he saw a growing concern about the gap between the fast developing digital technology and the legal and regulatory framework. Now, this is not just about AI, this is also about social media, cybersecurity. And because of that concern or that gap, we set up this institute to help address how we can bridge that gap by stimulating a global and multi-stakeholder discussion. Now, I have to make very clear, we do not own the discussion on accountability, but we want to act as a catalyst. So also this webinar is part of that ambition, that desire to have a global discussion, how we're going to deal with accountability. And just for your information, the picture behind me is of the Peace Palace in The Hague. The Institute is based in the city of The Hague and is one of the 4 UN cities. Now, to make a link to AI for Good, when we started in 2017, we had the very first event at the office of the ITU. For me, it was very much about awareness creation. What does AI have to offer? Immediately in the second year, we saw showcasing great examples what artificial intelligence can do. And it was actually only in the last year that we saw the first mentions of the need for accountability in a couple of the keynote speakers. And we realized that we need to we want to develop AI for good. So we need to make certain that those systems are indeed doing what they're supposed to do. And if not, who are you going to call? And accountability in itself is not an end goal. It's a fundamental prerequisite, just like transparency, privacy, and security. So we're now continuing that debate. We started in 2015 with this online event. And actually right now, I would like to invite Amy van Wijnsbergen to zoom in on her views on how data ethics plays a role. This will be a 10-minute discussion, and then we'll get back to the next speaker. So Amy, welcome to this webinar, and very interested to hear what you have to share with the audience.
Thank you. Thanks, Fitz, for the warm invitation and welcome. Thank you to ITU for hosting this event, and to my panelist, Jan Kleijsen. I'm really looking forward to engaging in this discussion with you. So what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is try to unpack this concept of accountability as it relates to artificial intelligence. And I want to address 3 kind of key questions. Who is accountable? Who are we talking about when we're saying accountability? What are they accountable for? And why is this so important? I should also indicate that I am, as Fitz mentioned, I'm an associate professor at the Technical University of Delft here in the Netherlands, and I explore the area of ethics and robotics and artificial intelligence. And really, my work is about taking the abstract concepts from ethics and translating those into something that's very useful and usable for other academic disciplines. At the same time, I am also involved in civil society organizations, policy-making groups. I'm a member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on AI, and I also have a role in industry. I'm a fellow at the Deloitte Center for the Edge. So the reason why I share these different roles is to also explain that while I'm giving my talk, I'm trying to take insights from all of these different places and engage them in one sort of line or thread of communication. So getting into my talk, accountability. First of all, who are we talking about, right? I think it's important for us to remember that, sometimes when we hear these phrases like responsible AI or trustworthy AI or accountable AI, sometimes we have the tendency to think that the technology itself should be responsible or trustworthy or accountable for something. But I think it's really important that we recognize and understand that it should be the humans who are accountable for the decisions that are made in the design, the development, the deployment, and the use of artificial intelligence. Okay, so the first thing that I want to put on the table is that we're talking about humans being accountable for the creation, the deployment, and the use of this technology. And the second thing is that it's not just humans who are accountable in terms of how we develop the technology. That is very important, but that's one stage in the life cycle of the technology. Really, we need to be thinking about accountability on this broader scale, right? So at every moment in the life cycle of the development, the deployment, and the use of the technology, there are different things that need to be considered, and there needs to be individuals or teams who take ownership for accountability along these different life cycles. Now, the next question that I want to address is what? What are the humans actually accountable for? Of course, there's a variety of different themes or ways that one could address this, right? Cybersecurity, sustainability, it's a variety of different areas that you could approach this through. I am putting on the table ethics, right? That we need the humans to be accountable for anticipating ethical risks, for uncovering what those risks actually are or could be, for trying to make sense of those ethical risks, and then for mitigating or preventing those ethical risks. So the humans are responsible for what? For understanding and preventing ethical risks, again, throughout the entire life cycle of the development of artificial intelligence. Now, just briefly touching on the why is this important? Why am I putting this on the table? I'm suggesting that ethics, paying attention to ethics and the risks to societal values and societal ethics in general, that if we can establish procedures and systems to actually have organizations thinking about these considerations throughout the multiple life cycles of the technology, this is how we begin to establish trust, right? This is how we begin to establish trust in the systems that are put in place to create the technology and the people who are making, deploying, and using this technology. So that's sort of, in a nutshell what I'm talking about. But of course, it's important for me to also answer the question, what is ethics, right? What do I mean when I'm talking about ethics? The first thing that I want to say there is that, we see now around the world, there's over 130 different AI ethics guidelines or AI ethics principles. And this is a wonderful start. But it's important to know that ethics is not just principles. It's not just guidelines. It's so much more than that. It's really a continual reflection on what is going on when we introduce a technology into society. Okay, so now sometimes some people that you can talk to about the field of ethics, they might say, well, ethics is about what it means to be a good person, right? What are the virtues or the characteristics of an individual that we can say, yes, this is a good person? Other people might say that, no, ethics is more about a theory of right action. What does it mean to be able to say that an action is right or wrong or good or bad? And all of these are true, of course, but I think what's helpful for this conversation is to have a larger perspective of ethics. And this is an older Aristotelian view of ethics. And that is, we should really think of ethics as the study of the good life, what it is and how we can achieve it. And we use the language of values to be able to talk about the components of the good life. So values like sustainability, values like safety, security, privacy, well-being, these are the components of the good life, right? And so ethics is constantly looking at what are new components of the good life, how are these components within a society actually being realized, how are they being threatened? So ethics, the study of the good life, what it is and how we can achieve it. And then we have the introduction of technology. And it's very important because technology can actually change the way we think about the good life. It can help us to realize the good life, right? It can help us to somewhat be connected with people right now, as we are right now. Technology is helping to facilitate this, but it can also threaten components of the good life. It can make us feel insecure about our privacy when we're sharing data or when we're sharing information in this hyper digital space. So then the ethics of artificial intelligence is really looking at how does the design, development, the deployment, and the use of this technology actually impact the ability to realize the good life, or how does it change what the good life looks like in the end? Okay. So what I'm suggesting then is when we're talking about, humans being accountable for including ethics in the multiple design phases of artificial intelligence, is that we need to start thinking about ethics as a resource. Ethics as a tool that can help us create better technology. And what I mean when I say that ethics is a resource is that really the field, the entire domain of ethics is looking at how do we uncover risks to ethical values, right? Ethical values that might be impacted negatively or positively, and how do we promote the technologies that really help to foster the different values. So it's about uncovering values, but it's also about understanding those values. what does a value mean in today's world? And I think an interesting example to think about this is privacy, the value of privacy, and how we see that the meaning of privacy has changed over time. That some people might say privacy is dead, but it's not that privacy is dead, it's just that we understand it in a different way. So if you take healthcare as an example, privacy decades ago was really about keeping your body private, having control over the fact that no one could see your body if you were in a hospital room. You have a curtain to enclose around the patient's bed so that you have some privacy. Nobody else is looking at you. But now, jump forward to today, and really when people say privacy in the healthcare context, they're thinking about control over their health data. They're thinking about, do I have control over who has it, when it's shared, who else is allowed to see it and to use it? So privacy has not gone anywhere. It's just that it's changed in its meaning. And that's really important for us to understand, because when you say that there's a threat to privacy, you need to know what kind of a threat you're talking about. And the reason why you need to know what kind of a threat you're talking about is because only when you know this can you do something to prevent that threat or to mitigate that threat. So now, of course, I'm talking about ethics, and I'm saying that this is something we should be including as a way of enhancing or establishing accountability in the procedures that we use to create this technology. But I should also be clear that I'm not saying it's ethics or policy, ethics or regulation. No. Of course, we need both. We need to have the two together. But what I am saying or suggesting is that ethics is actually a way for us to understand what kind of policy we need. What are the values that are being threatened that we need policy in order to prevent those threats, in order to create a level playing ground that every company or organization must abide by? So it's not an either or, it's definitely a both, but I'm suggesting that ethics actually helps us to get to appropriate policy for this kind of technology. Not only that, but if we also start to embed ethics into organizations, we get to understand how the technology evolves and impacts our values and our conceptions of values over time. So it's one thing for us to understand that right now, there are certain ethical issues related to artificial intelligence, mostly around, if we're talking about machine learning, it's the black box of the algorithm. Who is responsible if we don't understand the rules that the model has actually generated? But 2 years from now, we might have different ethical risks that need to be taken into consideration in policy. And it's the job of ethics, when it's allowed to accompany the development, the design, the deployment of the technology, to be able to uncover and make sense of these new evolving ethical issues. And that way we can inform the continuous development of appropriate policy to protect citizens, consumers, and society in general. So with that, then, my suggestion, again, going back to who, what, or why are we talking about this, I address industry at this point, right? So the particular who that I'm talking to are the developers of artificial intelligence, the deployers of artificial intelligence, and oftentimes the users of artificial intelligence. So this could be, private industry, but also we're seeing public services using AI more and more. So as users, they should be thinking about this as well. But my suggestion to really be able to embed ethics or to have ethics accompany the design process is to think about it in 3 different sort of aspects. We can use ethics to inspire technical solutions, right? To create interfaces so that people understand where their data is going and how it's being used to train or to actually feed into an algorithm. We can use ethics to help establish appropriate governance mechanisms, right? So if we want to have ethics embedded into an organization, we need to establish ownership. This is how we achieve accountability, right? Is there an individual or a team of individuals in an organization that are taking ownership for data ethics, digital ethics, or the ethics of artificial intelligence that's happening? And I mean, having a team in place to create principles that a company can use as their sort of North Star or to guide them. But it's not just about principles, right? It's about also putting procedures in place to make sure that all of the actions that are taken within a company actually make sense. They map onto the principles that have already been established. But the third way that I suggest that ethics can really be used as a resource is to start thinking about embedding ethicists on design teams. So within an organization, you'll have a small group of individuals who are working to create a new artificial intelligence model, or who are using a model and using it for new applications. And I suggest that we include Ephesus on these teams. And the reason for this is because we usually have legal expertise, we have marketing expertise, we have computer scientists, graphic designers sometimes, and we need to now start to think about ethics or ethicists as being another skill that is added to the team, that helps us to think about the unintended consequences, to think about what values could be impacted, what this means, so that we can start mitigating and preventing at the very early stages of design and development. So when you take these three together, that you have technical solutions, governance solutions, and co-development as a way of really embracing ethics as a resource, you begin to harness ethics within a company. And this is really how you start to facilitate that trust in a company, that the company is doing something, not just saying, yes, we have ethics principles, but are really doing something to show that they're putting processes in place to manifest, to realize these principles. They're creating technical solutions, and they're making sure that ethics becomes embedded into the very fabric of the organizations. So another point that I wanted to make is that ethics is not the same as compliance, right? When you have a policy, when you have regulation, then you're talking about compliance. But it's really important to understand that ethics is voluntary. You're not doing ethics, AI ethics within an organization because you've been told that you have to do that. You're doing that because you believe it is the right thing to do for citizens and for society. And so if companies really want to show their commitment to establishing and or maintaining trust in this space, they need to act before regulation requires that they act. And I think, artificial intelligence for the SDGs is a really great example to showcase or to make this real. That companies are not obliged. This is not something that legally is demanded of them. But when they do this, when they say that they have a vested interest in creating their products to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, this is going a step further. This is really showing a commitment to being accountable for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then I should also say, let's take sustainability as a value, though, right? Uncovering what it means and why it's so important. And it's important for us to understand that AI for the SDGs is different from sustainable AI. And we also really need companies and organizations to be thinking about how they can create AI in a sustainable manner. So using ethics to inspire new kinds of innovation, whether it's reusable data sets, minimizing their computational power as much as possible for the training of algorithms, but using this value of ethics to actually inspire new kinds of innovation. So to close, what I was trying to do is to unpack this concept of accountability when it comes to artificial intelligence by addressing specifically the who, the what, and the why. Why is this so important? Who needs to be accountable, and what is it that they're accountable for? So I'm suggesting that accountable AI is directed at the human stakeholders who are involved in the entire life cycle of AI, so design, development, deployment, and use. And that one aspect or one way of kind of painting the picture, one thing that humans need to be responsible for is the inclusion, the incorporation of ethical reflection throughout the entire life cycle of the development of these products. And so when we can think of ethics in this way, that it's actually a contribution to better design, this really shows a new kind of face to ethics, yeah? That it's not stifling innovation, that it's not a hindrance to innovation, that it's really something that is meant to harness AI innovation while at the same time making sure that we protect citizens and we create better products, better for people and for planet. So thank you, that's me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Jan Kleijsen has to say.
Hey, Amy, thank you very much. You have given us a passionate presentation on things to consider. It definitely raised a number of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So Arthur and I will have a look at that and see how we're going to cover all those questions as much as possible, at least when we have our discussion afterwards. So thank you again. And it's now my honor and pleasure to introduce Jan Kleijsen. Jan is the Director, Information Society, and also responsible action against crime at the Council of Europe. And Jan will take us along with the Council of Europe's efforts to establish a legal framework for artificial intelligence. Jan, first of all, I want to thank you very much for your time and sharing your thoughts and information. I also assume you will say a couple of words on the Council of Europe for those people overseas who are not familiar with the Council of Europe. Okay.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for the introduction. Very many thanks to my good friend Amy for a brilliant presentation on the question of ethics. And of course, to our colleagues from the ITU for hosting this webinar. As I speak to you, I realize many of you are still very much under the suffering from the consequences of the pandemic. I hope, of course, first of all, that you're all safe and that your loved ones are safe. But I realize very strict restrictions still apply in many parts of the world. I'm speaking to you from Strasbourg, which is in France, where there has been a slight loosening of the lockdown is over. There's still measures in place, but unfortunately, in the recent days, the number of cases has increased again. So we're all very much worried about the situation. And before I say a word about the Council of Europe, let me say a few words on COVID and artificial intelligence, because many of us hoped that AI would somehow be a silver bullet, a magical wand that would help us find a very rapid solution to this nasty virus. So far it hasn't. It has certainly helped. It helped in research, in sharing research, in bringing scientists together. We had hoped it would perhaps bring governments more together as well, although intergovernmental cooperation seems to be lagging very much behind scientific cooperation. But it has not proven yet to be the magical solution we hoped for. And I'll develop that in a moment. A few words about the Council of Europe, which perhaps certainly those who are not from the European continent may be less familiar with. We're the oldest European organization. We bring together 47 member states. One of our founding fathers was Winston Churchill, but also Konrad Adenauer from Germany and others who, after World War II, decided to set up an organization to ensure the protection of human rights, rule of law, and democracy on the European continent. And these are the three objectives we are working for. We're very much a treaty-based organization, and we produce treaties, conventions. A well-known one is the European Convention on Human Rights, but that applies only to the 47 member states of the Council of Europe and to our some 850 million citizens here in Europe. But we also have other conventions that deal with new technologies, and that brings me to the immediate link with the subject of today. We have a cybercrime convention, the only cybercrime convention in the world that at the moment has 70 state parties, also from nearly all continents. And the Data Protection Convention that has 55 state parties, also from several continents, so going well beyond Europe. This to illustrate that the Council of Europe is not just working for a group of European states, but has set standards that have become really global benchmarks. Now, a word about accountability, the subject of today's talk. And I'll come back also to the current pandemic. I would like to define here accountability as confronting people with the actions they take, so that they cannot just do whatever. They will have to, at some point, confront the consequences and be faced with the consequences. And when we talk about artificial intelligence, a quote comes to mind from Jurassic Park, which I think many of you, if not every one of you, will have seen. It's actually the first Jurassic Park where this film, where this quote comes from, where at some point Jeff Goldblum, the scientist in the film, says when things go wrong, that you scientists were so preoccupied what could be done that never any one of you asked the question what should be done. And that is perhaps also something that relates to artificial intelligence. There are, despite the fact that it has not found a cure against COVID, it has, of course, a huge impact on our societies and will continue to have an even greater impact. Where governments try to use it specifically to fight the pandemic was by tracing apps, introducing proximity tracing apps. And what we have seen in most countries around the world is there has been remarkably little enthusiasm, remarkable little confidence of the public in these tracing apps. So clearly, as Amy also explained, there is a problem of trust. The issue of trust is very important. Now we can ask, is it understandable or is it reasonable that people have this mistrust of technology and artificial intelligence being used by governments? Can things actually go wrong? And I think we can all agree that things can indeed go wrong. I think it was about last week that in the United States, there were a series of reports about a wrongful arrest that was made on the basis of artificial intelligence. And not surprisingly, it was an Afro-American man that was wrongly arrested because of a biased facial recognition system. And we know that facial recognition, which relies very much, of course, on, like all AI systems, on the data that are fed into it, reproduces the bias in those data. And that is a problem that we have with facial recognition in AI. We also have that very much with the judicial use of AI in the judicial system, because biases are, of course, reproduced. That is an example of things that can go wrong. Other things that can go wrong with automated decision-making are even more dramatic when we think, for instance, of the Boeing 737 MAX, where apparently there was a problem with the automated decision-making and the impossibility of a human override, the impossibility for humans to take over if the automatic system fails. So it's quite understandable that there is a concern in the public about automated decision-making, and of course, privacy. The protection of data comes into play here very much, because we know that massive amounts of data are being gathered on all of us, because we use so many applications, because they're so very convenient. And of course, I'm one of them. But we also are, at least most of us are aware, that we pay a price. There is no such thing as a free lunch, and there is no such thing as a free application. We pay with our data. And we have a concern that these data can be abused, especially because the concentration of these data in the hands of just very few companies gives rise to, I think, understandable worries. However, regulating, by the way, this just the protection of privacy may not even be enough. There was a very interesting article in the Guardian this week pointing out that the computing power of the companies that collect this data is now such that they can actually respect individual privacy and still come up with AI and with suggestions, or more than suggestions, not only predicting what will happen, but prescribing what will happen. And that is, of course, a real shift that should give us time to reflect, should make us pause, that we're moving from automated systems helping us take decisions, predicting trends, to actually taking these decisions for us, and also even prescribing what we should be doing in future. The ethical frameworks are a very good basis, and Amy has convincingly demonstrated their importance. There are at the moment some 260 international ethical frameworks that have been collaborated in many cases by governments and civil society, and sometimes together with industry, so in a multi-stakeholder way. They have one thing in common: they're not binding. You cannot take a company or a government to court on the basis of the violation of an ethical framework. And that is why in the Council of Europe, we have started work on legal standards on artificial intelligence, taking, of course, the ethical frameworks as a basis, because there are very good principles in there. Let me give you one example, the Montreal Declaration, for instance. Excellent, excellent principles. However, you cannot enforce them at present. So looking at these ethical principles, looking at existing legal standards, I already mentioned the Data Protection Convention. We have, as I said, the Cybercrime Convention. In Europe, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, which contains many principles that also apply when governments delegate decision-making to machines. It's the governments that are responsible, whether they act through human agents or through mechanical or technological agents. But there are also new concerns. We have areas like medicine, for instance, where there are very strict standards, and where no doubt the many applications of artificial intelligence will already be covered under the existing regulations. But when you think, for instance, of self-driving cars, there we suddenly realize there is a gap, because our existing regulations do not foresee automated driving and decisions taken by vehicles, which, as we have sadly found out, because there have been fatal accidents, can also pose a risk to human lives. And the more of these vehicles we'll have on our streets, of course, the greater the chances are that things will go wrong. So we're very much convinced that we need to move from not just, that's the wrong word, certainly not, that we move from very important ethical standards, stress very important ethical standards, look at existing legal regulation, but move beyond that. Move beyond and start identifying in what areas the design and application of AI needs to be regulated. Like Amy, I'm not talking about regulating a technology. We're of course not talking about regulating AI as such. And there are certain applications of AI where perhaps legal regulation is not necessary, where perhaps self-regulation of industry can be sufficient. Thinking of music platforms to which many of us subscribe, whether song A is suggested to you or song B may not directly and will not directly affect your human rights in all cases I can think of. So perhaps their self-regulation would be okay. But when we think about facial recognition, when you may be arrested or worse because of wrong analysis, faulty, biased algorithms, then I think we really need to ensure your protection. So we're looking at these principles at the moment in the Council of Europe. We have set up a special committee of national experts who work together with experts from industry and civil society, and not just our European countries. We also have for instance, United States, Canada, Japan, Mexico, and other countries that are now applying to join these negotiations to examine the possibilities of such a legal framework for those users of AI which directly affect our human rights. Those applications, and we need to look at, preferably from the design phase already. You know the term privacy by design, also human rights by design, I would very much argue here. And of course, their application and their implementation by governments. This is something that is now being looked at. We hope before the end of the year to have an answer as to whether it is possible to have legal standards. I would personally very much argue for binding legal standards, but our governments are still discussing this. And should they come to an agreement as of next year, we hope it would be possible to start negotiating a treaty that would give broad guidance. It would not be micro prescription. It would give broad guidance on the basis of which sector-specific regulation could be developed. Now, some have argued that this would stifle innovation, but you may have, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the position taken by many big companies in recent times, all the very big ones, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts of this world, and many smaller ones who've argued, in fact, in favor of regulation, because they are aware of the abuse that can be made of their technology. They very much realize that good regulation is good for innovation, for responsible innovation, and for trusted AI, which of course is what we are also working for. And given the impact that AI will have on our societies, it is extremely important that we decide, and I'll conclude with this, that we decide very clearly what we want AI to do, how we want AI to do what we delegate it to it, but also what we decide AI should not do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hey, Jan, thank you very much for your presentation. My conclusion is, your basic conclusion is, there is always going to be a human responsible at the end of the day. We cannot just leave it to the technology. Okay. Now, there are a number of questions we have seen in the chat already. Actually, a question for both Jan and Amy is, you have indicated 260 frameworks on ethics, over 130 on AI, and a couple of people have questions where they can get a list. So maybe not right now or afterwards, you can share the links to that information. And
if I may, Fritz,
yeah.
Sorry, I can give an answer to that one straight away. An updated list has been made by an EU agency. So that's a partner organization. It's not the Council of Europe. It's an agency of the European Union based in Vienna, which is called the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency. And they have published recently published a list of all the ethical frameworks that exist.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much.
And then maybe just to be clear about, so I had a smaller number, 130, I think it's rising now. That was AI ethics principles. So not necessarily frameworks, but different organizations establishing. And that was from a Harvard group working on that, but I can send that later.
But that's the question, at least, that you can point people to where they can find the resources. Okay, hey, again, both thank you for the presentation, and I'm glad you're all now online. I also want to introduce now Arthur van der Wees, who will moderate this part of the discussion. So in the next 30 to 40 minutes, we will hope to cover as much of the questions and the feedback from the audience as possible. So Arthur, I'm going to hand it over to you, and also thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Fritz, and welcome everybody to the Q&A. I have followed the Q&A here in this session. Currently 21 questions, several are linked to the other. I think a couple I can answer myself in an let's say, introduction towards a question, and then Amy, Jan can both try to give input on the question as well as perhaps reflect on that as well. I would like to start with indeed the pandemic, because once again, nature has presented us with a daunting challenge, which is global. And of course, we have seen a lot of local and national interventions. To what extent do you think, AI, we're here in a global context here in this call, and AI for good, what kind of way do you think AI could help out, either perhaps not today, but perhaps next week or next year, because we will, of course, continue to see, unfortunately, new waves coming up on this current pandemic. So perhaps, Amy, can you start? Jan, can you start, please?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, we have seen great skepticism as regards contact tracing apps, which were presented in a way, also by the media, I must say, as the sort of possible, as a remedy, as a major remedy to contagion. What the media have strangely, and that is also part of this should be part, I think, of this discussion. What has been very much underrepresented is the very good use of AI in predicting particular outbreaks in certain areas, which is available. And as I mentioned before, in sharing data. If so much progress has already been made on vaccines and on treatment, in identifying what works, but also, of course, what doesn't work, that has to do with clinical trials, of course, because ultimately You cannot replace testing on humans to ascertain whether something is really effective, but to decide which molecules to test and how to put them together. Their AI has played a major role in making it at the moment possible for scientists all over the world within seconds to find out the results of their colleagues on other continents. And it is this particular use of AI in sharing data, in identifying what works, that and which goes very much underreported, I must say. That also for future pandemics, and we've already been warned that swine flu may be the next thing that hits us. But there, on all these issues, it is AI that helps to get the right information to the right people quickly.
Thank you.
Okay,
Amy?
Amy missed the question because of a technical hiccup. Maybe you can.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So Amy, the follow-up question on Jan, we just talked briefly about the pandemic and how AI data can help for good, as it's a global challenge, and not even though it's been picked up and taken care of so far quite locally. But perhaps we can add the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to that. You know, we have 17 to play with, and we have 169 targets that are related to those. And as we are here in AI for Good, how can AI help out with this very important these very important targets that are some are doing quite well, some are and others are lacking a bit.
Thank you. Sorry for my poor connection. If I start to freeze, please give me a signal somehow. So first, if I could also build on what Jan was saying about the benefits, that we can achieve through AI in this current pandemic. I think what's also important, and another concept that we can draw from the ethics of technology, is a way of understanding the technology when it's introduced into society. So I think it's really important that industry, that consumers, that citizens know that when we're using something like an app to track and trace individuals as a way of preventing the spread, of course, that's a noble goal, but at the same time, it's an experiment. Right? We don't know exactly what the positive outcomes will be, what the negative outcomes will be on the short term and the long term. And I think it's time now that we start to be very transparent and clear about the fact that when AI is used in society, we have very little operational experience with it, and we need to start framing it as an experiment. And the reason why that is so important is because once we make it an explicit experiment, then we also need to put safeguards in place. We need to make sure that the people that are subjects in this experiment are protected. So I just wanted to say that quick follow-up. But when we're talking about artificial intelligence to achieve the SDGs, the second question that you had asked me, I think, we are seeing some progress in a variety of different spaces, whether it's healthcare, whether it's raising people up out of poverty, whether it's energy consumption and how we can understand where we can actually start to create more sustainable infrastructures in organizations. Again, though, what I said in my talk, I think it's really important for us to recognize this distinction between AI for the SDGs and sustainable AI, that we need to start looking at sustainable AI as the precursor, the necessary requirement before we even get into AI for the SDGs. And that means making sure that there's an assessment on minimizing computational power required for training, that we have companies who are explicitly looking into reusable data sources, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Amy. So I would like to also, because I saw a couple of questions related to it, to ask Jan on what he sees or what he would envision on who could be let's say, impartial, independent party or agency that could help out in, the measuring the explainability and the accountability of AI. Of course, as Amy mentioned, the organization that is deploying it, including the data they're using, of course, are primarily, accountable or co-accountable. But how can we, as society, also have some trust that can be verified in some kind of way. And any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. That brings me to the question of certification, which is something we're looking at in the framework of the legal answers we're looking for, whether we should not also, for the specific AI that poses risks that I mentioned, and not for all AI once again, but for AI that poses risk, whether we should not certify. Let me give you two examples. An NGO, which is called Algorithm Watch, went to have a look at algorithms used by a federal job agency in a European country. It is a job agency that is responsible for, actually, it's the national job agency, so people who are unemployed try to go there and try to find a job, and it's the duty of that agency to transmit offers to those people who are looking for jobs. And it turns out much of that has been automated and is in fact done by algorithms and AI, so therefore through AI. Now, interestingly enough, what Algorithm Watch found in this country was that disabled people and single mothers were not getting any job offers. And it examined the algorithms, and it found this was the fault of the faulty programming. It was not the result of the data. It was the algorithms themselves that were tweaked in such a way that if you were a single mother or a disabled person, you would not get any job offers. So a clear case of discrimination in the algorithms itself, not in the data. Many of us are aware of biased data, but here we're actually speaking about biased algorithms. And of course, that should give us a great cause for concern. It also teaches us something. It teaches us that if an NGO can establish this, can ascertain this, it should certainly be also possible for an independent agency to do so. So one of the possibilities we will be looking at is to see whether, as for medicine, which is also certified, and in fact, within the Council of Europe, we are responsible for the European Pharmacopoeia, which has a major role in this, whether it would be possible to set up an international agency that would actually certify particular uses of AI in risk areas. That can be done through a central body established in a member state, like an agency, for instance, like the Pharmacopoeia we have here. Could also be a network of national institutions, but working with the same standards. And I'm giving this particular example of medicine because some pushback one hears is that, yes, but companies would never want to share this information with you because of their business model, of course, depends on it, and their profits depend on it. But that's also true for medicine. And of course, the agencies that evaluate the medicine and that certify their conformity will not share the formula with the competitors. And that, of course, would then also apply to the algorithms. So I think it is very important that we look at this question of certification, because I think it's essential for trust. It's actually also an indication of what is still lacking in the digital world. The microphones we are using, even the chairs we sit on during this webinar, have to meet all sorts of certifications. But most of the applications we use in our daily lives on our smartphones and our other devices, and which have a much bigger impact on our lives than the chairs we sit on, are not subject to any certification.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure whether Amy is still there, but I can't see her.
Here.
Good.
Yeah,
okay.
I just turned off my camera for.
So Amy, we got a couple of questions which I recognize as well. You know, we talk about accountability, we talk about ethics, and these are, well, especially accountability is sort of a new term that is going around. You know, I'm being a lawyer, you know, I'm used to it, but normally, of course, we talk about responsibility, and then, you know, if things go wrong, or really wrong, liability, and of course, we want to avoid that. But there were some questions on, you know, whether human rights are a part of ethics, and yeah, what kind of, whether it's whether it differs per country or continent or religion. Perhaps it is good. What do you think? You know, we talk about AI, the definition. These are generally very broad. Accountability is quite broad, and ethics as well. How can we, you know, shed some light on that instead of having to read 130 guidelines.
You don't want to read 130 guidelines?
I would love to read. I actually read quite a few of them, yes.
Yeah, no, I'm so I think that's a great question, one that I do hear coming up quite a bit. I think it's important for me to also clarify what I mean when I say to use ethics as a resource or to have an ethicist who is on a design team. I'm not saying that the ethicist is the one who has all of the right answers, that the ethicist is the one to say, yes, do this, no, do not do that. I'm instead saying that the ethicist is meant to stimulate a kind of thinking, a kind of reflection on, yes, how do we understand if this technology is doing something good or doing something bad? And that collectively, the team or the company or the organization decides this is the direction that we want to go in. But attached to that, I mean, I agree with Jan Kleijsen about having regulation, especially when we're talking about high risk AI applications. But attached to that, it's also transparency is important. So I think what we also need to do is to require organizations to go through this kind of reflective process, to be transparent about it, that yes, they chose this data or they validated the model in this way. They are using it for this application because of this principle, of that principle. And that's when we can really start to have a large scale conversation about aligning ethics between cities, between cultures and whatnot. But right now it's too, it's not helpful to say that we can't do anything with ethics because we have to choose whose ethics is it and so on and so forth. We need to start the process of using ethics to be critical of the technology, to have companies be transparent about that. And that's when we can really have an engaged conversation, knowing what's going on within the company.
So, Amy, follow-up question on that for you. It was also asked in the Q&A. How can you deploy that? And I know you have done that before in real life. Deploy that by design in ethical specifications. Now, how can we help out that it's not only the engineers and the architects making a functional specification, but that the non-functionals, like the things you mentioned, including privacy and security and even the SDGs and everything, would be incorporated. Yeah. And there, by the way, there's also a question on whether there are some nice examples about that.
Right. Okay. So when I'm wearing my academic hat, I publish on the topic of ethicists as designer, and including an ethicist as a part of the design team. And so I've done that at Center for Telematics and Information Technology. I've done that as an institute where I am there to help the computer scientists, understand, I'm legally allowed to scrape from this source, but I don't know if I really should do that. So help them also working through these questions. I'm also right now on a team where I'm the ethicist when we're designing a social robot or a robot that's meant for human-robot interaction. And my job is meant to almost be a kind of hacker, that I sit at the table and I say, all right, let's think, what can go wrong? What could possibly go wrong if we ask for this data point, if we have the robot speak in a certain way? So my role is to almost hack the design process, if you will. But I do this in other contexts as well. I'll stop my video again because I'm not sure how my connection is. I do this as an individual within the Deloitte infrastructure. And so again, I am there to speak with clients who are interested in doing something about data ethics, about digital ethics. And my job is to be in the room to say, what could go wrong? What kind of policies could you create? And so on and so forth. We use digital ethics canvases and that kind of thing. And another way that I'm involved with this kind of inclusion of ethics in the design process is I'm co-founder, co-director of a not-for-profit organization called the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. And we are developing a quality mark, which Arthur, you're also involved in this project. We're developing a quality mark to try and not necessarily provide certification, but to try and provide an assurance to consumers who will buy a robot product that this product has gone through a very rigorous process of an internal audit, if you will. So looking at principles like sustainability, fairness, privacy, and then we speak to the company about all of the design decisions that are made. Do they have documentation to show that they have thought about these issues? What are they doing about these issues? And in that way, we're trying to get closer to bringing ethics into the actual design process of an AI-driven robot, and to be able to signal, to notify consumers that the company has taken an extra step, has done something more to achieve ethics embedded in their design.
Thank you very much, Amy. So to you, Jan, on the same topic, what kind of tooling could we think of, or are you perhaps thinking of, on helping out in verifying? So we can of course do it with more paper. All the guidelines probably are written in a language human readable, but why not start doing more enforcement and verification in the same means that you have to encounter, which is AI on that end, or at least something digital. Do you see any developments there?
Well, to perhaps come back what I said earlier about the certification, the idea is not very much just to shift paper on this. I'm sure Algorithm Watch, when in the example I gave, and by the way, they did another one very recently on Instagram, which was much published, which actually drew a few interesting conclusions about gender equality and bare skin on Instagram. But they had programmers looking at that. So for me, the certification would be done by experts. By programmers, computer scientists, whatever, engineers, not by simple lawyers like myself, but really people who can dissect the algorithms and can actually identify, as Algorithm Watch did, identify the flaws and the discrimination inherent in the programming.
And a follow-up question, Jan, thanks for that. A follow-up question for you. There was a question in the chat on the Council of Europe's Convention on Privacy. There was a question on what the differences are with the GDPR. I think we don't have time for that, but perhaps you can give some high-level response. And then my question is, do we need personal identifiable information, so personal data, to do proper AI? Or can we say, by default, we should not have or use any personal data? What are your thoughts on that?
Very quick question, very quick reply, sorry, to the question on the GDPR and the Council of Europe's Convention. The Council of Europe's Convention is the mother of the GDPR. The convention is much older, it's called Convention 108. Then came the European Union with the GDPR, and as a result, we have modernized our convention now to bring it in line with GDPR and go even further. And the European Union will now also become a party to this new convention. So we are going upwards together, if you like, moving forward together on this one. And the second question, sorry, if you can just...
The second question is, principle number one could be, and I'm just raising it, no personal data by default when you talk about AI systems.
Yeah, that is of course that is an interesting option. And for instance, on the tracing apps, that is what many countries decided, and because authorities thought that, and rightly judged that giving too much, sharing too much personal data and centralizing them would discourage the public from using these tracing anti-COVID contagion apps. But nonetheless, the citizen wasn't convinced. And again, to refer to the article in The Guardian, it was quite convincingly pointed out that even if we protect our private data so that you and I cannot be identified immediately, and that the information we have on our devices actually stays there, the AI and the sheer computing power of industry now makes it possible nonetheless to identify trends and then micro target us. So protecting privacy is extremely important, but it's not going to be enough.
Yeah, Amy, your thoughts?
On whether or not we should...
Yeah, well, we to what extent, if we need to use or should use PII or not, personal data, and indeed, as Jan mentioned, could be that you're not having it as input but then even still the output could be personal data. So on that side, you need to have something accountable as well. So
Right.
it's not indeed only input and output. That is not how this world works nowadays.
And I think so. I guess to hack again, I would ask, why are we not using the personally identifiable information? And is that to protect anonymity? But then I would push back and say, can we actually protect anonymity? Because as Jan rightly pointed out, even if we don't use personal information, it's still possible when you combine different data sources, when you look at the kinds of predictions that you can make with using machine learning algorithms, then I would ask, is that even possible? Or is there another alternative that we could be looking at?
So on that, any thoughts on how to avoid dual use? You know, either intended or unintended, because we have seen and heard, and the introduction was as well, that, you know, the engineers are enthusiastic, they love to code, and then later on they need to call me because they get sued, and I don't want them to call me. I want to help them out upstream. So how do we avoid dual use? I'm not talking in a military context, just in a general context, for good or for ill. You know, that's already a difficult context. Concept.
If I may kick off there, I would go back to Jurassic Park, and I think it really, but it's really quite, it really does apply, I think, to artificial intelligence. And I mean, obviously, the decoders, the people who are enthusiastic, they're thinking all the time of what the system can do. It can do this, it can do that. But does that mean that we should do it? Perhaps they should. What should we do? Should really be much more carefully assessed. And of course, AI can do all sorts of things, but should it do all sorts of things? There should, I think, be red lines. By the way, the Council of Europe also pioneered red lines when it comes to technology. Many of you will remember when the sheep Dolly was cloned. Within 2 years afterwards, we established a legal instrument prohibiting human cloning. Why? Not because human cloning couldn't be done. It could very well be done. Sheep Dolly had just proven that it was very likely to be possible, but it shouldn't be done. So I think that sort of consideration should be very much on the top of our minds.
Absolutely.
If I can build on that, what Jan is also putting on the table here, this is very much what we discuss in ethics, right? It's very much a cornerstone, making this distinction between, yes, you can do it, but should you do it? So it's not just about having ethics guidelines and principles and practices in place, but it's also about providing education or awareness to the people within an organization. Give them the space to be able to ask these questions, to be able to think about what are their red lines, and do they disagree with the company that they're working for because they've been asked to do something. So we also need to start thinking about ethics as a tool, not only in the creation of technology, but as a resource for the people who are involved in the making of the technology. Give them the tools to be able to critically reflect. And I mean, we see that in the Netherlands, that now it's mandatory. If you're in computer sciences, if you're in any technical studies, going through university, you have to take at least one ethics course. So we're trying to embrace this idea that, yes, it's wonderful for students to have the technical skills and the know-how, but they also need to be equipped with the ability to critically reflect. And that's also something that humans do and the AI can't do, right? So we should, be proud of the skills that we have and hone them and really appreciate them for what they provide.
Yeah, thank you. Jan, you wanted to?
No, I think I agree.
Yeah, fine. Okay. So your Jurassic Park, who would have thought? That's something I think it makes sense to convey the message that also Amy just said on how do we make sure that they understand, instead of that we are lecturing or as a lawyer, and try to explain or convince people. I stopped convincing people. I try to make sure that they understand themselves. And one of the things will be that they will need to look into the Jurassic Park movie. I think that's a very good one. Also, perhaps, in cybersecurity, we nowadays have cyber ranges, where you can do in a virtual non-productive environment, you see what can possibly go wrong. Perhaps we need to think about, AI ranges, where we can do the same things and have fun and see where we can have the most impact for good. Another one that I have for you is if anybody, so this is also for the audience, if anybody asks you what else can we do with this data, then probably this is not allowed by law or ethically. So that is one that you would want to avoid. And indeed, I think Amy talked about scraping. That's also a term that raises a flag. It may not be red, but it's definitely a flag. So there we can also, from our human intelligence side, already identify when things may go wrong, and then try to either successfully or not, at least attempt to help out. Amy already mentioned you need to have an ethicist in a team to develop. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Amy, it's not about only the upstream, but also the midstream, where you start converging, AI systems and components and data points, and then, of course, always down the use and the hopefully positive impact on the life cycle. My point is the following, or my question is the following. We do have driver licenses, and I know the Council of Europe is helping out with my green card in Europe, that I can drive in countries that I've not even contacted with before, but I'm allowed to drive there. But what are your thoughts on not a verse license, but a driving license? So a license of the car, which of course includes hundreds of components, probably also a lot of sensors and radio equipment. Because you will be enjoying at the back seat a nice drive to either vacation or business or family.
I think perhaps I'd like to take you up actually on the driving license of the person, because it brings me to a very important point, which so far we haven't touched upon, and that is AI literacy. AI is already shaping the lives of most of us in more ways than we could actually imagine. I think even if we now, all the participants to this webinar, would list 10 issues on which AI is already influencing their lives, I bet that all of us would at least forget 10 other ones where it's also happening and which we didn't think of in the first place. So it's already shaping us, our lives. I think this is certainly an informed audience. But if you go to speak to the people in the street, how many people would actually be aware of how AI is shaping their lives and what they can do about it? There's also a huge digital divide. The digital divide is something that has been often referred to when we speak about the global south and the richer world, if you like. But it also exists very much in affluent societies. One of the criticisms of these contact tracing apps to fight the pandemic, for instance, in the country I live in, which is France, but the example is from France, but it would apply to many, many other highly industrialized countries, is that about a quarter of the French people do not have a smartphone. They may have a form of mobile phone, but they don't have a smartphone, and they would not be able to use an application. And this is also generational. A lot of the more vulnerable people to COVID-19 are those that do not master the digital technology. So I think your example of a driving license, the car will be checked, and I think the certifications that I mentioned could be part of that. But for the people that actually use AI or are subjected to AI, I think it's extremely important that they are taught what they're dealing with. They don't have to be able to program, but they should be told, you're now dealing with artificial intelligence. In this case, the California law that obliges companies, which have more than, I think now 1 million customers is the current threshold, but I think that may be moving, requires that these companies inform their customers that they are actually dealing with an automated system and not with human beings. And that should certainly, to my mind, be also part of our legal framework, an obligation on governments, that when governments delegate authority to machines, that the citizen is told that he or she is dealing with a machine, and A, and B, that there must be always, as it's pointed out in the various data protection text, when it comes to data protection, that also in other issues, there must be the possibility of the famous human in control, the human override. There must be an appeal possible to a human decision maker.
Yeah, thank you, Jan.
If I could just add something to that, Arthur. I agree with Jan. I think another interesting concept to think about is de-skilling. So the idea of, when we delegate something to the machine, we no longer will be practicing that. So we will no longer acquire the skills that are necessary. So at a certain moment in time, you can imagine that if we continue to delegate to systems to, maybe even to drive, then we will, after generations, have individuals who no longer know how to drive. And maybe that's not necessarily a fundamental skill that we must hang on to. But if it is, thinking about what is fair, what is reasonable, or if you're in an airplane situation, right, and you have planes that are basically flying themselves, and then what does a pilot do when something goes wrong? Because if they're used to the plane handling it, then what happens when the human has to take over? But they don't have the skills of practicing the takeover. So we could see that in medical applications, if AI systems are making calls on analyzing data, analyzing images, and things like that. So I just wanted to add to Jan's, it's absolutely upskilling, reskilling literacy of what the technology is capable of and what its limitations are. But we should also have, take a step back to think about what skills do we want to maintain as a society? Right? We want to continue to be social people. So that means we have to make sure that AI doesn't step in and take over social roles. We want humans to continue to develop those skills.
And if I may, Arthur, may I just add to what Amy says, because this is a very interesting point. If I may, it is not only, we very much agree with her, but it goes even further. What about our democratic skills? Because the more we delegate, and the more we trust machines, the less we will be making informed choices ourselves. And that will have a huge impact on our societies. Already now, there are applications in many countries that help the voter to make up her or his choice. That you answer a questionnaire online and the machine will say, well, you should vote for this party. And in a few years' time, perhaps we will not even fill in the questionnaire anymore. And the machine will just tell us who to vote for. And we'll lose our ability to critically assess what our decision makers are putting before us. And that will have a massive impact on our society.
Yeah, absolutely, Jan. So I think we also established that it's not only about certification of the data or the algorithms or the ecosystem, or even a whole platform like a car or a plane for that matter, but also actually the persons, either engineer or all the way down. I think that's very good. It's a personal, we keep nicely personal. On the personal level, I would like to ask you one more question. I think I covered most of the questions in the chat box to some extent. But one is that, when we talk about personal, we have the great capability, the biggest capability that we have here, both here in this chat, but also globally, is more than 7 billion people with supercomputers between their ears. So how can we, we are poorly organized. We're poorly organized ourselves, and therefore sometimes we are either happy or not that certain corporates or others are walking away with knowledge. But how can we, what would be your thoughts to try to set up a movement on, let's say, citizen engaged public good? Because again, the supercomputer is between the ear. You don't need to have gone to university. You don't need to mobile phone for that. But we're not yet organized well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we were speaking also about the Sustainable Development Goals here. I think education. I think this comes back to AI literacy, but goes far beyond it. It's education. Of course, you're quite right about the supercomputer between the ears, but that's the human brain. But if children in so many countries do not get even a basic education, not only they won't even reach the digital gap because they'll be left out before. So for me, therefore, education and their companies, and of course AI and applications can be of tremendous help if the political will is there to ensure that everyone can benefit from it. There's a big movement now that everyone should get a free vaccine against COVID-19. I think we should join to that to make sure that everyone also has access to the technology that will shape their future.
Thank you, Jan. Amy?
I of course agree with Jan, and then I would add on to that educational component. Yes, understand what AI is capable of, how it's being applied, but again, starting to teach people to be critical. So to teach people to second guess it, to think about what it looks like when you trust the technology too much, how far that can actually go. So I agree with the component of education, but I would almost say a different kind of literacy. In addition to literacy about the technology, how it's made and what it's capable of, start empowering people to ask questions, because when they start to ask questions, then companies actually, perk up their ears and think, oh, right. Okay. So you're asking me this question. I guess I should probably tell you what data I have about you. I guess I should think twice before I share this data. So I think it's an addition to literacy, but it's a different kind of illiteracy.
Right. So Jan, Amy, I would like to ask you one more question on some final thoughts or summary or recommendations or shout outs, call to actions. Anything goes. It's up to you. The floor is yours. Take your time. So can I, of course, give the floor first to Amy? Perhaps first Jan, because Amy, you're on mute. Perhaps you need to get the camera off. Jan, go ahead.
Okay. Well, perhaps to come back to what I said earlier in the presentation, it is absolutely vital that we, based on ethical standards, but move to legally binding regulation, at least for the critical and AI applications, the abuse of which can be extremely dangerous, can threaten our lives, threaten our societies, can threaten our freedoms. That's the first. Secondly, close international cooperation on this. Which we have seen, to my mind, insufficiently in the COVID area, and thirdly, doing this together very much with civil society, of course, with industry, which has to be on board, and perhaps finally to do it fast.
Thank you very much, Jan.
And I guess in closing, I would say, I of course agree with everything that Jan has put on the table, but I also think it's important for us to recognize that we can't stop with the ethics. So even once we have regulation, which we will in Europe have regulation for AI, but even once that happens, we need to recognize that the nature of the ethical issues, their prioritization, they will change with time. As we understand more about the technology, the issues and the risks will change. And so we need to have this kind of ethical, critical reflection accompany the development and the deployment of the technology so that we can have this kind of feedback loop with policymakers and with regulators. So I think I hear a lot that it's, ethics or regulation, and we have to stop that way of thinking, and it needs to be, we need both of them working together in a collaborative manner, and that goes for human rights as well. So when I was discussing ethics, of course I talked about values in the language of values, but human rights are a cornerstone of ethics. So absolutely that becomes a central feature of the conversation. And then my last point is to remember or to start to conceptualize that when any technology is first introduced into society, and especially with artificial intelligence, we need to understand that this is an experiment. This is a social experiment, and we must put safeguards in place. And some of those safeguards in place will be policy and regulation to prevent risks to fundamental human rights. And some of those safeguards will be ethical technology assessments, making sure that companies are thinking about what could possibly go wrong, even if it's on a minimal scale, so that we start to learn more about this experiment that we're all involved in.
Thanks, Amy. Again, thank you very much for your passionate response and contribution. I really love it. And Jan, as well, for you, I really like your input as well. So I made a lot of notes. I learned a lot as well. And again, thank you. And I'll now give it back to Fitz as the main moderator. You're mute, Fitz.
My apologies. I want to thank Jan, Arthur, and Amy for this lively discussion. And also want to thank all the delegates for all the interaction and the questions. We haven't been able to cover everything completely, but the gist we did. So in the chat, I will put the email and the address of the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age. So if anybody has a question or some feedback input, please share, and we'll do our best to make sure that information gets spread. Finally, some final thoughts from my side to give with you. Again, I want to thank the ITU for this opportunity. As said in introduction, we want to act as a catalyst for this discussion on accountability in the digital age. So that's what we've done today. We will continue this discussion after the summer when we'll produce a report on the summit we had in The Hague last year. And we hope to have a webinar presenting the findings of the report and some key observations. So I want to thank again everybody for this opportunity and hand it back to Jane of the ITU, which will close the session. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Fritz. So what an insightful and intense discussion. A big thanks to our panelists as well as to all the participants for making it so engaging. And before we wrap up, I'd like to highlight a few things that may be of interest. So tomorrow we have a session on channel estimation, machine learning applied to the physical layer of a millimeter wave MIMO. And next Tuesday on 7th of July, there's a webinar on artificial intelligence in aviation. And on Thursday, which is 9th of July, we have prepared a keynote session on new ways of thinking of the mobile phone for healthcare and the current pandemic. So we are pasting the links for the registrations in the chat, and you can also find this information as well as lots of other information and background material on aiforgood.itu.int. So with that, I'd like to close today's webinar and once again like to thank everyone involved, our panel, our participants, our partner sponsors, and the co-convener Switzerland. Thank you very much and hope to see you again at the next webinar. Stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.